Hello again. So welcome back to this concepts about reserves and related, which are part of the last thing that we saw, because we just learned about how to classify transactions, which is also very important. But then we need to make the connection with macroeconomics and with international finance, because then it doesn't make any sense that I'm teaching you this about balance of payments. So with this video, I want to explain to, to convince you that this is relevant for the purpose of this course. So I was starting here with reserves and related, because I explained that countries prefer to have reserves because with reserves they can do things. But I also told you that it depends on the system that each country has, the impact of reserves, because there are some reserves where the impact of, sorry, there are some systems where the impact of reserves is more important than in others. And I will explain in a second. But for this, I want to tell you a story. I think in the last class I didn't talk too much about stories, but now I want to talk about story. And this is a real story, and this is quite interesting. So if I ask you which is the country with more reserves in the world, the answer is China. China is the country with more reserves of all currencies in the world, but especially with dollars. They have a reserve of more than uh, 3 trillion dollars. This is from 2010. So right now they have more than $3 trillion. And why is this important? This is important because China can do whatever they want with the reserves, because they have so many reserves that they can do whatever they want. This is different compared to, for example, Mexico. We have quite a lot of reserves, as you can see in the graph, but we don't have enough reserves to play as gods with reserves. We have some reserves, but we can run out of reserves. And why is this important for China? Because I think I explained before in a couple of classes ago that China has a soft peg exchange rate system, right? So they manipulate the supply and demand of currencies in order to have like some stability, right? It's not a hard peg as other currencies, but still a very strict soft peg. So China can do this, and also China can do a lot of things thanks to the reserves that they have. So this is the story that I want to talk about. How has China been able to do a lot of interesting things in terms of their balance of payments? So for this, I want to use this marker in here because I want to explain some context. In this example in here, I told you that the country that we were talking about had -10 in the current account and +5 in the financial account, and that is usually, and that's kind of normal. It's more, it's similar to, it's almost a law. Uh, uh, Before 2001, economists thought that this was a law, that if you have a surplus in the capital account, like in the case of Germany, for example, Germany is a country that sells a lot of goods and expensive goods like medicine, airplanes, cars, and they buy cheap things like food. So Germany is a country that has a surplus on the current account. The logic and what happens with Germany is that they also have a deficit on the financial account, right? And this is also logic. If you are rich because you receive a lot of money from the capital account, what do? You invest, and usually you invest abroad. So this is what happens in the case of Germany. Surplus in the current account, deficit on the financial account. This is Germany. Now, the opposite, deficit in the current account and surplus in the financial account. This is the case of the US. Why is it like this? The US is the country with the best financial system in the world and the best legal framework in terms of finance. So everyone that wants to invest invests in the US. If you think about investments, you always think about New York, and probably after this, maybe London or Frankfurt, but usually it is New York generally. So the US receives a lot of money from the financial account. And what do they do with money? What do you do when you are rich? You spend money on what? On goods. That's why the US imports a lot of things, services and goods. And it's also part of the culture. The American culture is more about consuming German culture is more about producing, so it makes sense. Economy makes sense with culture. If you think about Mexico, we have kind of a mix, and this is normal for most countries, that in some years you have a surplus in the current account and deficit in financial, or the other way around, capital and financial, the other way around. This was normal and almost like a rule until 2001, because in 2001 something really weird happened with China. And and I will explain how does China usually looks like. China usually looks like this, like Germany. China looks like a country that exports a lot, because that's what China used to do. Well, still doing, but they used to do a lot in the 90s: export, 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 and goods, TVs, electronics, blah blah. And they still do now, like cars, motorcycles, computers, phones, everything. They export a lot of things, and then they also invest a little bit. So their balance of payments looks similar to this one. But in 2001, something extraordinary happened. They experienced um, what the economists call the twin towers of China. They experienced a surplus in the financial account and also in the current account. So this was China 2001. Why did this happen? This happened mainly because China became very important for investment too. At that point in time, do you remember? I think I talked about this in the first class, that in the south of Asia, there was a huge economic crisis. And also in the US, there was some crisis in the before the 2000s. So it was quite a hectic moment in the world, and China was doing really, really good in terms of economy. So a lot of people went to invest in China. This is where a lot of firms moved from maybe Japan or Germany to China, like a lot of Apple factories, for example, were created in China. Also, Sony produced in China too. They were in Japan, and then they moved. A lot of countries invested in China a lot. And so imagine they were becoming super rich because they receive a lot of money from the financial account and also from the current account. This was incredibly good for China, but it has a huge risk. What happens when from one day to the other or one year to the other, everyone becomes very rich? It might sound weird that it's a problem, but it's actually a problem. When everyone becomes rich from one day to the other, there is a problem that we call, in economic terms, that the economy is getting overheated. It's getting very hot. Why? Because people have so much money, but there are not enough goods, and there is a risk for inflation. So China was experiencing this thing where they were getting more and more dollars, but that was very risky for China. But how did they solve this thing? It's fascinating. And let me tell you the story. Finally, the story after all the context. So for this story, I want you to imagine yourself as a rich person, a rich Chinese person from the 2000s. So your age is probably 50 years old. So you were born in 1950s in China, and imagine in this story that you just sold a lot of shoes or electronics to the US, so you have a lot of dollars in your hand. Maybe you have $100 million. You have a lot of money. You are very rich. So in this story, you go to the bank because you want to change your dollars to yuans, right? Because the dollars are useless in China. You need to have yuans. So you go and you exchange your dollars. And the person in the bank, first of all, the bank is controlled by the government. So there is government influence in there. And the person from the bank says, okay, I can change the dollars to yuans, that's fine. But before you leave the bank, have you thought about the future of your children? Have you thought about the education of your children? And then you as a Chinese person might get scared, and you will say like, why are you talking about? What's that thing about thinking about my children? And then, or child, because they could only have one one child. Okay. So the person in the bank will say, uh, because when you were young, you were poor, right? Because that's a thing from China, that in the 50s they were super poor. So the Chinese person will say, yes, that's true. I was super poor. So I don't want my children to experience that. And then the person from the bank will say, so you know what? Instead of going and take your yuans with you, that will be dumb. Don't spend the yuans. That's kind of selfish too. Don't do that. Give me back the yuans and I will give you a piece of paper that says that in 10 years or 20 years, I will give you your yuans plus some interest rate. And then your children will be able to go to university and then they will be able to buy a car and they won't experience your own experience when you were poor when you were a kid and your father. So the Chinese person will be really happy to do that. It kind of matched with the culture of Chinese people at that point in time, where they were a lot about saving. They didn't consume a lot. They were very all about working and saving. That was the mindset of Chinese people some years ago. And they will say, okay, I agree with this. I will give you the yuans back and you give me the paper and I will keep the paper. That was fantastic for the Chinese economy. They destroyed the forecast of international economy, saying that the Chinese economy will overheat and will go into a crisis, because they were able to become super rich in terms of reserves, in terms of exporting, in terms of their own financial system, in terms of receiving investment. But thanks to this kind of cultural trick where they convince the Chinese people to not consume, and so the yuans stayed in the bank, the market wasn't flooded with this money. They were allowed to not increase the inflation. And that was kind of a miracle, but it's not really a miracle. It was a really good strategy from Chinese economists. So they kind of played with the culture that Chinese people had, because this wouldn't work in Germany, this wouldn't work in the US, this wouldn't work in Japan. It could only work in China. And at that specific point in time, it was a fantastic thing that worked really well in China. So they were able to maintain this thing for about 5 years. So that's why they were able to hold so many dollars, so many reserves. They became their economy boomed without inflation. So it was fantastic from the economic point of view. But later, this strategy was not perfect. Let me finish the story. So when the Chinese person left the bank, the Chinese banker will say like, okay, I have a lot of yuans, I have a lot of dollars. What do I do with this? So with the yuans, they would sometimes burn the yuans. In some cases in China, it was cheaper to burn the yuans than to send them back to the central bank. In other cases, they didn't even have the yuans with them because they didn't want the yuans to be in the market. And with the dollars, what about the dollars? They had a lot of dollars in here and they had to do something with the dollars. So what did they do? They called the US and they say, I have a lot of dollars in my pocket. Do you want dollars? I can lend you some dollars. And the US uh, was hungry for dollars, and they say, okay, but I can only pay you less than 1%. Is it okay for you, China? And China said, yes, I don't care. I have a lot of dollars, so whatever you want. So that's why the US has a huge debt in dollars with China, but it's a healthy debt because it the interest rate is almost zero. And from the Chinese point of view, it's also nice because they have a lot of dollars. They can do whatever they want with that, they are getting a little bit of interest from that. The objective of this reserve is not to make profit from that. The objective is only to have the dollars whenever they need it, so they can do whatever they want. So at this point, China and the US were really happy, and they are actually really good friends in terms of economy. In politics, they don't like each other, but in economy, they are best friends. I think President Donald Trump and or ex-President Donald Trump and the Chinese Prime Minister, not only this one Xi Jinping, but all the prime ministers from China and most of the presidents in the US, but Donald Trump in specific, tried to make like a media war between them, but in fact they are not enemies. They are really good friends because their economy work really good together. China was able to become rich and expand their economy, and at the same point the US was able to get a lot of debt from them, almost free debt. So they were able to get more than $3 trillion almost for free. That's fantastic news for both countries. But this is a but this is not working anymore. And why? Because the Chinese generation changed. Now the rich Chinese people were born in the 90s, and in the 90s, China wasn't that poor. Or maybe they are the children of the old rich guys, and now Chinese people like to consume. That's one thing. So now their consumption in China is increasing, and that's a huge risk. And second thing, that the Chinese people are not again that happy with investing only in paper, so they are buying houses. So they bought a lot of houses in China, and they have a huge uh, um, housing bubble in China because everything is very expensive. I think the most expensive place in the world to buy a house, it's in the financial district in Shanghai. It's the most expensive place, and not because it's worth. It's because there is a bubble. People have so much money that they want to invest somewhere and they want to go in there. I think one of the most expensive departments in the world is the one that Jackie Chan has in the financial district. And from his point of view, I think it's like an investment because he thinks that the bubble will increase even more its value. And this bubble is not only in China; it exists also in other countries, like in London. Like half of London is owned by Chinese people. In Australia too, in Singapore too, in Japan, in Hong Kong, because they are expanding themselves. Last year, I was in New Zealand, and they told me about a law that. Doesn't allow Chinese people to own more than one house because apparently Chinese people were also buying houses in New Zealand, and then they were also experiencing a bubble on housing prices. That's why it's super expensive to buy or rent a house or department in London or Paris because a lot of Chinese people investing because they have so much money. But from one point of view, we have this huge bubble, like the bubble of inflation from Chinese people consuming right now and also investing in houses and a lot of things. But the economy has slowed down significantly since the world economic crisis from 10 years ago, and now with this terrible economic crisis that we have right now, so the pressure has decreased, so we don't have that much pressure. Like Chinese people is not that rich anymore, so we kind of have that thing. But still, a risk is something that we need to be careful about. So I hope that you like this idea and you kind of understand the impact of the balance of payments and how governments can make strategies that can make a country super rich in 20 years, like the case of China, or in 10 years, like the case of Germany and Japan, if they play good, if they play well with their strategies, or it can be a disaster, like in the case of Mexico, in the case of Southern Asian countries, in the case of Latin American countries where the strategy didn't work out well, and it was kind of a disaster, like what happened in Mexico in the 70s and the 80s. So I think this video was quite long. I hope that you like the story. We're going to continue with a few concepts that I need to clarify that are similar to this.